They had been taught that capture was worse than death. That lesson lived in their bones. Surrender was shame, dishonor inked into a family's name, a stain that could follow generations. So when nearly 300 Japanese women were unloaded from trucks into a guarded camp beneath a wide, shimmering desert sky, each step across the dust felt like a small, private apocalypse. Trucks coughed up exhausted bodies, heat rose in waves from the packed earth, razor wire glinted in the sunlight, watchtowers cast thin, immovable shadows, and the low clang of a gate closing sounded like a verdict. The women arrived wary, eyes lowered, shoulders curved inward as if to make themselves smaller. They expected humiliation, beatings, public shaming, the rituals their culture had warned them would follow capture. Instead, what met them was procedural order and surprisingly deliberate gentleness. American guards stood behind rifles, but with measured, non-threatening faces. Nurses moved through the lines with white aprons and careful hands. A translator named Ko, about 24, whispered between languages and between worlds. There were 6 Japanese officers with them, attempting to hold on to a chain of authority that had already been broken by surrender. For the women, that presence of their former superiors was a bitter reminder. The old rules still clung to them, even when old power had dissolved. Ko watched as an American nurse placed a hand on the wrist of a trembling woman and checked her pulse, asking, in a tone stripped of curiosity and filled with concern, whether anyone had hurt her. It was a small procedural question, but it landed like a miracle. A bowl of steaming oats was set before a woman who had been without a proper meal for days. The first bite brought tears. Outside, the wind carried dust. Inside the mess hall, the smell of hot toast and butter seemed almost indecent in its normalcy. Clean clothing was issued, not thrown down, folded with a quiet respect no one had anticipated. One woman clutched the new shirt to her chest as if it were a found relic. If this story is something you want to see more of, subscribe now. There are many untold moments like this from the war. The camp had routines that tried to restore rhythm to lives that had been ruptured. At 6 o'clock the bell rang, a clear, punctual note that cut through the desert stillness and summoned everyone toward the day. Bed-making and inspections echoed the old military strictness the women knew well, but now the enforcement came from different hands. Work assignments followed, tasks in kitchens, in laundry, in small maintenance crews. The American staff organized it all with the faint aim of offering agency, a wage system of coin paid for chores that felt strangely empowering after days of helplessness. A few coins were enough sometimes to buy a bar of chocolate, a bar held like treasure, unwrapped with fingers that trembled between gratitude and disbelief.
Recovery stitched itself into daily, ordinary things. Faces that had hollowed from hunger rounded, hands that shook grew steadier as muscles remembered small tasks, washing a pot, sweeping a floor, stirring soup. Hair regained a dull sheen, and the physical reassembly of bodies was matched by quieter, inward shifts. Yet for many it was not relief so much as a painful contradiction, nourishment and care arriving under the same sky that had produced the catastrophe of war. Letters began to arrive from Japan, folded pages that carried both news and accusation. In them were hints of devastation, rumors of disgrace, and the subtle arrows of social expectation. How could they be taken in alive? How could one reconcile being fed by the so-called enemy? The 6 Japanese officers moved among the women like dark weather. They attempted to reassert a hierarchy that no longer had legal force, but still had cultural muscle. They insisted on decorum, on silence, on signs of penitence. They would gather women in small groups and speak in clipped tones that left the younger ones shaking. Sometimes the orders were merely humiliating, one woman forced to recite apologies, another made to adopt a stance of lowered head. The officers used shame as a tool to keep a moral line intact. For many women, that line had become more important than life itself. Tensions accumulated slowly in small, grinding ways, a hum in the barracks that turned a head, a borrowed spoon that wasn't returned, a letter that made someone weep alone in a corner. Ko moved among these edges, translating, comforting, watching the emotional arithmetic turn. Every kindness the Americans extended made the shame feel sharper, as if accepting food or shelter were a public confession of weakness. Yet kindness persisted, not as showroom virtue, but in low human acts. A nurse smoothing a blanket over a sleeping shoulder, a guard slipping a fruit into a pocket, a cook offering an extra slice of meat. One morning, the rhythm of the camp intersected with danger in a sound so small that it could almost have been overlooked, a soft, private melody. Sakura was 19, slight, and often the first to close her eyes during the quiet hours where the memory of losses pressed loudest. She had begun humming. It was nothing more than a tune picked up in passing, a U.S. lullaby, perhaps, or a simple melody that had lodged behind her teeth and come out as a hushed habit. In the crowded barracks, whispered songs traveled like contraband, dangerous because they suggested something more than obedience, because they hinted at private comfort outside the officer's control. A Japanese lieutenant, his jaw set in the old way of men who had been trained to see moral order as the only order, heard the hum and moved towards it with a quickness that made others stand taller in their seats. He grabbed Sakura's arm roughly, his fingers a public claim on private space. The barracks hushed, eyes darted, breaths held.
Shame and fear pooled, ready to be poured back into meaning. This was punishment for those who defied decorum, the officers seemed to say. It was a sanitation of morale, a reminder that surrender did not erase judgment. Then, unexpectedly, a pair of hands cut across that tableau. Sergeant Miller stepped between the lieutenant and Sakura with an immediacy that reframed the moment. He did not shout, he did not escalate, he positioned himself in a way that shielded the young woman from the lieutenant's reach. The simple geometry of his stance, body aligned with protection, said more than words could. Around him, American guards had rifles slung and faces set, not in triumph, but in clarity. Here, abuse would not be allowed to continue. The lieutenant bristled, authority flaring, but he was confronted not by anonymous force, but an actual line of command. The camp commander, Captain Richards, moved in shortly after, walking with a measured step, his face neutral, but his decision already apparent in the way he surveyed the scene. He made his enforcement public and formal. He declared in crisp, enforceable terms that the women were under the protection of the camp, that any attempts at physical punishment or coercion would not be tolerated. This was not a sermon, it was a declaration, backed by the instruments of order the Americans controlled. What happened in those moments did more than prevent a single assault. It rewired power in the camp. The officers who had used shame as leverage found that leverage fraying. They could still bark orders, but the enforcement of physical punishment, once an implicit option, had been cut off. The change was both legal and symbolic. For the women who had lived under a doctrine that equated dishonor with death, seeing someone put his body between them and harm was transformative. Not a rescue from war exactly, but a protective act that made survival less an abandonment of honor and more a human choice. Inside the barracks, the release was not cinematic. Tears did not necessarily come all at once. Some women exhaled, some closed their eyes, and some continued to hold the old grief as if it were a cloak they could not yet remove.
but a new feeling crept in alongside the old, permission to be cared for. A nurse's hand stayed longer on a wrist. A guard who had once stood at the gate without speaking now offered a piece of fruit. These small things were not compensation for everything that had been lost, but they were real. They mattered. After the incident, the Japanese officers were moved away from some positions of direct influence in the camp. They remained present in other ways, protocol and the sullen gravity of men who had lost status, but their ability to inflict immediate physical humiliation had been curtailed. That reallocation was structural, not total. The moral complexities of repatriation and return would remain for all involved. For the women, the immediate outcome felt like a fragile safety.
As days turned into weeks, other scenes accumulated like beads on a string. A woman crying over a generous slice of meat as if it were sacrament. Another counting coins from wages, deciding whether to buy chocolate or save for something else. Ko translating sentences that tried to bridge fear and gratitude, altering tone to keep dignity intact. Little possessions started to matter again. One of the most telling tokens was an English-Japanese dictionary. It arrived, modest and hopeful, as if it were both an instrument of language and a talisman of connection. When departures loomed, when the time came to organize repatriation, the women prepared in ways that mixed efficiency with sorrow. They packed in silence. There were gifts exchanged in muted ceremonies. Soldiers gave small things, a watch cleaned, a ration of sweets, a blanket folded with care. These were not gestures of triumph. They were gestures of human farewell, tentative and sincere. Ko received the dictionary not as a trophy, but as a tool, a promise that there would be words, someday, to speak the indebtedness and the complexity of what had happened there. Yet the departure was not an ending that erased inner conflict. Many women feared returning to Japan more than they feared staying in a foreign camp under certain protection. Some imagined the reception at home, whispers, pointed looks, the possibility of ostracism. For others, there was relief, a chance to rebuild in the place that, however scarred, still held family and history. The soldiers who had sheltered them left with no illusions about righting the past. They left with the knowledge that a few acts of protection had ripple effects that would continue to unfold in long, unpredictable ways. Years became decades. The desert camp dissolved into memory and archive. The watchtowers were taken down, the wire rusted. Men and women who had stood there scattered into ordinary lives. But memory kept its own evidences. In Tokyo, an older woman, Ko, now a survivor whose youth had been marked by those weeks, would many years later open a thin, worn English-Japanese dictionary and trace letters with fingers that remembered the weight of heat and the softness of a nurse's hand. The pages of that book had softened at the edges, the spine repaired, the cover creased from long use. It was more than reference. It was proof that someone had reached across wartime divisions and offered language and safety in a moment when both seemed impossible. Her recollections did not settle into tidy lessons. She could still feel the sting of cultural shame that had been seeded into her family, and she retained the ache of losses that neither food nor shelter could erase.
But overlaid on that ache were specific images that returned without sentimentality. Sergeant Miller stepping forward when someone else might have turned away. Captain Richards speaking plainly and acting to protect. A nurse smoothing a blanket over a recoil of shoulders. The simple significance of a chocolate bar held like treasure between two palms. Those gestures did not fix everything. They did not erase suffering. They did, however, become the proof points of human choice in a world that had been taught to see everything in absolutes. In remembering, Ko did something careful.
She named individuals, she preserved the dignity of those who were frightened, and she refused to tell a story that flattened either side into caricature. She could recognize harshness where it had occurred, and humanity where it had been offered. The dictionary sat on her bookshelf, a small, stubborn token of that balance. When she opened it, she thought of the man who had handed it to her, not as a representative of a nation, but as a person who had put himself forward at a moment of moral risk. That act of protection had a life beyond its immediate effect. It had become part of how she told her own story. There is something brittle and yet stubborn in memories like these. They resist being polished into moral lessons or weaponized into national myths. The protection the women received at that camp was concrete and limited. It did not absolve either side of wider responsibility or erase the pain of war. What it did show, distinctly and quietly, was that in the machinery of conflict, individuals sometimes make choices that preserve other individual lives. That kind of protection leaves traces, a healed wrist, a saved piece of dignity, a dictionary with thumbprints. Those traces accumulate into a legacy not of triumph, but of moral courage and human tenderness. The desert did not stop being a place of heat and dust, but inside its circumference, for a fragile season, protection took the place of punishment. For nearly 300 women who had come with the weight of inescapable shame, the unexpected shield of a few soldiers and staff altered a chapter of their lives. It did not make all things right, but it made survival possible in a way they could accept without erasing themselves. In the end, Coe's memory of that time is not a neat narrative of heroes and villains. It is a braided account of fear and care, of officers who tried to keep a dying order and soldiers who chose intervention. It is the image of a young woman holding a dictionary, a tool, a gift, a small anchor that connected languages and, by extension, connected people. It is also a reminder that compassion in wartime is neither abundant nor guaranteed. It appears in decisions like the one Sergeant Miller made when he stepped between a woman and harm. It is sustained by commanders like Captain Richards, who backed those choices with policy and action.
And it is carried forward in the quiet lives of the women who left the camp with a few coins, a bar of chocolate, and a burden of complicated memory. If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more narratives about courage and compassion in wartime.